Hello, thank you for joining me today. My name is Marcos Lopez-Carlson, and I am one of your co-students in Communications 405 at the University of North Dakota. And today, this is my discussion assignment, where I will be talking about this week's readings from Alone Together by Cheryl Turkle and Understanding Digital Culture by Vincent Miller. Now, these are two pretty different readings with really different focuses, and so we will do quite a shift halfway through this discussion. Now, the first part is the Cheryl Turkle book, Alone Together. And really what she's talking about in this book, or in this chapter, is the robot as a caregiver and a coach. Now, one of the main takeaways from this was that people form bonds with robots. Not really a huge shock at this point. It's kind of been the overarching theme for the last 100 pages, that people do form bonds with robots. But what's interesting in this one is the application, or the way that the robots are being used that cause these bonds to be formed. So she's really talking a lot about, in this chapter, robots as life coaches, where robots are used for weight loss and behavioral modifications and in different ways. One of the interesting stories she's talking about is how people would have a robot introduced into their household, where it was a small little anthropomorphized 2-foot tall being, and after a while they would put a hat on it and they would give it names, and this robot was there to help them lose weight and to get them to lead a healthier lifestyle. She's also talking a lot about the My Real Baby and the way that the elderly would form these relationships where they felt needed and where they were able to have interactions and relationships with the robot. I believe she relates it to the way that sometimes people want to be alone with their memories. Sometimes they would want to be alone and just talk to the robot. And an interesting idea and turn of phrase that she uses to describe the way that bond forms when we have a robot as a feedback mechanism is that the robot goes from being a projection and goes to being something that we interact with. Or as she refers to it, it goes from being Rorschach to relationship. It's a really nice turn of phrase, and I think it expresses it quite succinctly. So, one of the things, though, that we keep talking about in this book and in this chapter in these robots is the way that we talk to them and the way that people interact with the robot, the way that the robot talks back to us, but also in many ways, and what keeps coming up, is that the robots look like us. And I wonder if this is, if it doesn't really represent the way that I feel a lot of communication technology is going. In some ways, especially in relationship with cloud technology, I feel that a lot of this focus on the physical anthropomorphized robot is a little bit quaint, a little bit old-fashioned. And does a robot really have to behave like that anymore? Does it have to look like us? I think about, for instance, this class. I am in a class with a number of students, and we have had conversations, we have had discussions, we have shared ideas. I know some of you, but we've never actually met. And until you see this video, I could actually have just been a really sophisticated Turing engine and not have actually been a human being in this class at all. So I kind of want to take this idea of a robot, that thing that has a physical presence that we're interacting with, and kind of apply a little bit of the cloud to it. So follow with me on this thought experiment. Back to the weight loss robot that we had talked about earlier, where people were getting feedback about the head of robots, and the robot would keep track of how much they weighed, how much they're eating, and would give them feedback on that, and they developed a relationship. So, we have a scale. The scale is, through a little device called the XB, is able to be wirelessly connected to a home network. So you have your scale, which measures your weight. which is connected to your refrigerator. The refrigerator keeps track of how much you're eating and what your intake is. And that's connected to, that's connected to a pedometer, which keeps track of your activities and how much you are doing. So you have these three things. You have, your weight, you have your consumption, and you have your activity. These are the same things that robot was measuring. The only thing that robot was offering was an interactive interface. Well, we have that interactive interface available through the cloud as well. So, with all of these things brought together, serving the same purpose as a robot, but now interacting through the Internet of Things, we have a cloud robot. And expanded a little bit more. We have a digital picture frame, which is able to take a before picture of what you did look like as you embarked on a weight loss program, for instance, and a camera that's able to give one updated images and see how one has changed. So we're getting that same kind of relationship and that same robotic or that same personal interaction, but it's been applied to the cloud rather than as a physical, anthropomorphized part of our life. So I really would welcome some feedback and hear your thoughts on what you think about a robot as an application of the cloud and not just as a physical thing that does stuff for us. Does this Internet of Things, is that able to serve the same purpose and form or be a part of that same emotional bond and connection that we make with robots? Because, does a robot have to look like us? Is that part of the rule? Or does it have to look like a baby seal? Now, the last part of this chapter, she does talk about a place where I do think the robot as a physical presence and as a thing that people interact with does have a place and is pretty important. And it's a really interesting idea, and that's the robot as a caregiver and a robot as a nurse. Now, a little bit of context for myself. My mother, about 2 years ago, suffered from a traumatic brain injury, which rendered her incapable of creating or maintaining new memories. So hanging out with my mom for a couple hours involves answering the exact same question over and over, 20, 30, 40 times in that 2-hour block. And it becomes emotionally challenging, and I'm just visiting her. I can't imagine how emotionally challenging and difficult that can be for a professional caregiver. It requires a lot of patience, and it's very trying. So the idea of a robot as a caregiver is really interesting, not as a replacement, because I do think that at this point we're not ready to just surround the elderly with robots and not continue to be involved with them. That sounds like a terrible idea. But as a supplement to caregivers, I think there's a lot of really interesting potential. When we have, a robot that's available 24 hours a day to do assistance, to assist with bathing, to make sure that people are taking their medications. And even, as that baby seal served, people were able to care for something and talk to it and have a little bit of their memories and have some personal interaction. There really is, I think, a role for that. And I really appreciate the way that Cheryl Turkle talked about how that could happen and how that could take place. So that kind of sums up the ideas of this chapter, which is the robot as a caregiver and a coach. I was really appreciative of this chapter because it had really felt like we were kind of starting to talk about really expensive toys for a while, and the focus had really been on gimmicks and less on ways that robots could be a part of a person's life and affect changes and be of assistance. And especially going into the next section, the Vincent Miller reading, I was finding a lot of the robotics that we had been reading about to be kind of bourgeois, especially since the Miller stuff is talking about digital inequality.